Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 17 of the Clarineat Podcast. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. Today, our featured guest is Ed Joffe, who has been a vital part of the New York music scene for over 40 years. He has performed in every type of musical situation imaginable, ranging from Broadway shows such as Fosse and Victor Victoria, chamber ensembles such as the Philip Glass and Steve Reich ensembles, and orchestral performances with the New York Philharmonic and New York City Ballet Orchestras. Ed has offered numerous clinics on woodwinds and jazz at music education conferences and universities. He is a graduate of the Juilliard School and the first person to receive his doctorate in multiple woodwind performance from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. Dr. Joffe has worked and studied with some of the most respected artists of our time, including Joe Allard, Eddie Daniels, and Ron Reuben. Ed was a professor of music at New Jersey City University for 24 years and was coordinator of Jazz and Woodwind Studies. Under his guidance, these programs were hailed among the best in the country. Ed is a very interesting man. We had tons of great conversation, and so much that I actually want to break this episode into 3 different ones. Across the 3 episodes, we talk about his life on Broadway, his career as a doubler, his new CD Contrasts, and his really interesting book called Doubling for Saxophone, Clarinet, and Flute. These items can be purchased directly from Ed at joffewoodwinds.com. That's Joffe Woodwinds, Joffe, woodwinds.com. The giveaway for this series of episodes is a signed copy of Ed's new CD shipped anywhere in the world free of charge. If you'd like to be eligible to win items mentioned on the podcast, please subscribe to the email newsletter at clarineat.com. You'll also receive monthly updates, exclusive offers and discount codes, and insight into upcoming guests on the show. Before we get started, I wanted to play a little bit of music from Ed's upcoming CD, and then we'll dive right into part 1 of the interview. This is a tune called It's All About Buddy, which is a musical tribute to jazz artist Buddy DeFranco. Welcome to the Clarineat Podcast, Ed. I'm so thrilled to have you on the show today, and I really thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks, Sean. I'm delighted to be here and to discuss anything related to woodwinds and woodwind doubling.
Yeah, that's the main focus of the interview today, but I'm also hoping to address your amazing book and the CD which you recently released called Contrasts. In fact, you're one of those guests that I feel like I could just talk to all afternoon, so we may have to break this into a 1 or 2 or 3 episode podcast, and in a way that'd be fantastic if we do that, just because I really want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to hear all that you have to say. There's so much. I started reading your book and I was just overwhelmed with knowledge, if that makes sense.
Well, if it's helpful in that way, I'm glad. That's certainly my intent, to try to reach as many people as possible with information that truthfully I didn't know about until I began the research.
And that's actually what was so surprising to me, is that I was like, how do I not know a lot of this stuff as a woodwind player? So it's really, really fascinating to read about.
Well, the truth is, I don't think any of us knew about a lot of this stuff. Certainly when I went to school, if I had known some of the things that I uncovered in this book, it would have made life a little more interesting, and maybe would have toned down some of the professors' prejudices against people who play many woodwind instruments and certainly play music other than Western European classical music.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. But first, let's talk about what kind of got you into doubling at the beginning. In your book, you share a really interesting story about an experience, a very unlikely experience. I don't remember what the place was, but I believe it was an interaction between you and a stripper of all things. So would you share Cole's Notes version of that story with us?
Yeah, what a way to start the interview. Okay. Well, first of all, I my love for playing woodwinds was due to my father, and he had been a saxophone and clarinetist as a young fellow, and had studied with actually the same teacher who was Stan Getz's main teacher, a fellow named Bill Shiner. And so my dad would occasionally take out the saxophone or clarinet when I was a kid and would play it around the house. And I loved the look of it. I loved the smell of it. And he had a beautiful sound. He really did. But he never went into music, unfortunately. He should have, but he didn't. And, so when it became time for me to get some music lessons, my mother played a little piano, so I started on piano. And then my father got me one of his teachers to work with. He would come to the house weekly, and I would study clarinet, which was my first woodwind instrument. And then by the time I got to sixth grade, I had started clarinet in fourth grade. And when I was in sixth grade, I started on alto sax as well. So right from the beginning, I was playing saxophone and clarinet. And, I never knew anything else. I said, well, that's what you're supposed to do. And then by the time I got to college and majoring in music, kids were getting together and playing in bands and earning money, mostly through things we call club dates here, or sometimes referred to as casuals, where you play for dinner dancers or weddings, or bar mitzvahs, or any kind of functions. And you'd play pop tunes of the day and also standards of the American Songbook. And so in the summer of my freshman year at college, a few of my classmates and I got together, had a little band, and we worked up in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. It's also referred to sometimes as the Borscht Belt. And what that was a community of roughly about 100 miles north of New York City, where there were hundreds of hotels and smaller bungalow colonies where people would go to vacation, especially in the summer months. In the 1950s and 60s, into the 70s, you have to remember, there was very little or no air conditioning at all. So when the summer months came, people would escape the city heat and would travel to the mountains. And this was something that was brought to this country by Europeans, because Europeans did that routinely. They would leave their major cities and travel to mountain areas, mountain communities, to vacation and, either ski or just have a good time. So that concept was brought to 20th century America, and in New York, we had the Catskill Mountains. So my friends and I in this little band worked in a bungalow colony our first summer as college, undergraduate music majors. And one of the shows we had to play the first weekend, our very first gig, was backing a stripper. Now, strippers, especially bungalow colony strippers, used to do 2 or 3 shows a night. They would just jump from one bungalow colony to another down the road, maybe 10 miles to another one, and make their, taste that way. And so they were used to coming in and talking down a show, which means that you didn't really have a rehearsal of the music. They just said, okay, we're going to start off with like a tune like Night Train in a certain key. I want it at this tempo, and then we're going to jump to maybe Caravan by, Ellington's Caravan, and then maybe we'll do a slow number like the Mizzaloo. I mean, they would go from one tune to another, and we're sitting there, 18, 19-year-olds. We have no idea what we're supposed to do, and she's talking it down. And then she turns to me and she said, "Who's the woodwind player here?" And, I raised my hand because here I am, totally innocent. And I mean innocent. You wouldn't find another 18, 19-year-old as innocent as I was then. I was ridiculous. I was the ultimate nerd. Man, it would be a sad sight to see today. But she said, "Okay, do you double?" And I had no idea what she meant by doubling. I thought she was hitting on me. And I thought, and I started stuttering. And she said, "Well, you know what I mean. Do you play a lot of woodwind instruments?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I play saxophone and clarinet." And, because I had alto sax and tenor sax and clarinet on the stand for that gig. And she said, "Don't you play flute?" And at that time, I did not. So I said, "No." She said, "You're not a doubler. you don't play flute, you're not a doubler. And she just sneered at me and like turned away and talked to the other guys. And here I was. I had no idea what was happening, but she obviously insulted me, and I had no idea why. But all I know is I wasn't a doubler according to the stripper. So that got me to trying to figure out, well, what is a doubler? And I have to play saxophone, clarinet, and flute as the minimal requirement. And then the next year at school, I started studying flute.
Right away.
So I owe my career to a stripper.
Well, it's so interesting, though, how sometimes even the most unlikely people sort of plant a seed in your mind that sort of grows into something. And it's very doubtful that that lady would have known that she influenced that in you.
Believe me, bungalow strippers couldn't care less about what they influence other than getting their paycheck.
Yeah, but it's just so weird. Such an interesting story.
Oh, of course, yeah. No, and it was absolutely true. I couldn't have invented that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But as the years went by, I started saying, Jesus, if it wasn't for that stripper, maybe I wouldn't have started flute the next year. Maybe it would have been several years later. Because quite frankly, I didn't want to play flute at that time. My younger brother, had played flute as a kid because it was recommended to him. His particular overbite, where he needed braces, allowed him to play flute and not saxophone or clarinet initially. And my periodontal problems as a kid, where I needed braces, allowed me to play saxophone and clarinet, but not flute. So when I tried, as a younger kid to play flute, the first thing I remember was getting dizzy and almost passing out. Which is a common occurrence when you play your first few notes on flute, and you tend to overblow, and you don't know how to direct the air, etc. So I didn't want to play flute until the stripper insulted me.
Yeah. So although that sounds like a bit of an odd story, this situation ended up inspiring you to be the best you could be on all woodwinds, not just the clarinet or saxophone. And you were actually the first person to graduate from the Graduate Center of the City of New York.
Yes, it's from the City University of New York. Yeah. Well, that's true, but I do have to throw in another major influence. I mean, the stripper story is cute and all of that, and certainly got me to study flute. But the person whose playing really knocked me out and absolutely became a role model for me as a young player was Eddie Daniels. I had, like all the other kids, we watched late night television because in those days, all of the late night shows had big bands. And the woodwind, and we had 5 saxophone doubling woodwind chairs in those shows, and they were phenomenal musicians. So one night I was watching the Dick Cavett show, and Eddie Daniels was featured on a station break playing Cherokee at the most incredible tempo. And they kept the camera on Eddie for a good minute. Quite unusual. You'd never see that today, but the Cavett show was an unusual show in many ways. And I thought, wow, this guy is amazing. And around that time, I also began my studies with Joe Allard, who was also Eddie Daniels' teacher. And Joe would often mention Eddie. And so I knew his name, and then when I heard him play on the Cavett show, it blew me away. And then I went down to hear him play at the Village Vanguard with the Thad Jones and Mel Lewis Orchestra, which was the top American jazz orchestra of the day, and it quite frankly still is 50 years later. And then I heard him play clarinet. And then he released an album shortly thereafter called A Flower for All Seasons, where he plays half the album on flute and half the album on clarinet. And that blew me away. So ultimately, I went to study with Eddie, because I wanted to be a studio musician, a staff musician like Eddie was. He was staff on ABC for that period of time. He was on the Dick Cavett show. So my very first lesson with Eddie was life-changing for a number of reasons. His first question to me was, what do you want to do? And I told him, I said, I want to do exactly what you're doing. And he immediately, as only Eddie could do, told me bluntly, without any emotion, after my job ends, there will no longer be any staff musician positions in New York or anywhere else. We're the last that's going to exist. And of course, as a young kid, you tend not to believe these things, but Eddie was absolutely right and honest to a T, as he always is. And it proved to be correct. But he also asked me, what are your other goals? I told him I want to play jazz clarinet. And he said, okay, what do you want to play? And I told him I wanted to play this tune, There Will Never Be Another You, which is a, popular standard, especially for jazz players. And he said, okay. I took out my clarinet and he said, play it at the piano first. And I said, what? He said, yeah, play it at the piano. Let me see what you can do at the piano. And of course, I knew harmonically maybe the first 4 changes of the tune. I really had never done this before, sitting at the piano, chording the tune, and even improvising on the tune. And of course, Eddie could do that in his sleep. It was incredible. So that got me to studying music and understanding harmony better, and certainly improving my piano chops so that I could, I have decent piano chops as far as just chording behind any tune, or I could probably play behind a singer and, not embarrass myself these days. But so Eddie's first lesson was pretty right on the money as far as what you have to know as a musician and be responsible for, but also a reality check that those type of studio staff musician jobs were going away. But that didn't discourage me anyway. I really loved all the instruments, and I loved lots of music. And, his virtuosity and brilliance and dedication on all those instruments always was a standard that I held high.
Yeah, Eddie's fantastic. I'm hoping to one day have him on the show too, actually.
You should.
Do you have another story you'd like to share about your time working with him? Because that's just a glimpse that people don't get to.
People today know him as the top jazz clarinetist, but he was really one of the most incredible young jazz tenor players. In fact, he won first prize in a jazz competition in Austria in the 1960s, and as a result, the very first album he made was called First Prize. And he was one of the original saxophone players, 5 of the 5-member sax section of the original Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra. And Eddie's playing on tenor and clarinet in that orchestra is phenomenal. As a flutist, I ended up studying flute with him for a while, and he really was so dedicated as a flute player that people may not know this, but at one time he won an audition to be the flutist in a major New York City woodwind quintet, and of course turned it down. He just took the audition as a lark. But he's that incredible a virtuoso. And as a result of studying with Eddie on flute, I ended up studying with Tom Neifinger, because Eddie had studied with Tom Neifinger for many years and was friends with him. And Tom Neifinger ended up being my friend and greatest influence on flute playing, and I owe him as much as I owe Eddie, and for my career. So Eddie's influence was pretty widespread for me. I will tell you a little funny story that happened a few years ago at the International Clarinet Association conference that was in L.A. I think this is about 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. I was doing a tribute to my teacher and Eddie's late teacher, Joe Allard, and I enlisted Eddie to play a piece with me with a couple of other clarinetists. We had a quartet written dedicated to Joe Allard. A friend of mine from L.A., great jazz clarinetist and pianist Tom Rainier, wrote the piece. And so we only had a chance to rehearse it the day of the performance because we were, I was coming from New York, Eddie was coming from Santa Fe, New Mexico. John Cipolla, who joined us, was coming from Kentucky, and Gary Bouvier was the resident person from L.A. there. So the 4 of us got together that morning to have a 1-hour rehearsal on this quartet that was brand new. And since I had commissioned it, I had gotten all the parts, and I had run a rehearsal in New York, and I had played Eddie's part to get an understanding of what, was going to face each person so that I could sort of circumvent any problems and, make the rehearsal as, efficient as possible. So we got down, we set upon it and started playing. And in the third movement of this piece, it's a huge solo for Eddie's part, the top part, where he's improvising throughout much of the movement. And the improvisation is not in any way predictable, cyclical. It's chords that you would not anticipate on any level. And Eddie was basically sight reading it, to be honest with you, because, he's so busy and, he never had time to look over the part. So he asked some questions. We started playing, and I was playing the bass clarinet part. So I was sitting directly opposite Eddie. I mean, maybe within 2-3 feet. And we started playing, and all of a sudden, he is playing something that's so unbelievable and magical and just ridiculous that about halfway through his improvisation, I got lost and had to stop because I was listening to him. And it was absolutely the most incredible thing to hear a player of this nature, first time through, just devour a part and create an improvisation that was so perfect that you couldn't have written out a better an improvisation. He is that way. He's a soloist and a first take player who can just play the most incredible things the first time through. And that's what a good studio player can do as well. They can sight read anything, capture the emotion and the feeling of a piece. And that's something we don't have today because all of that type of work is really gone. But Eddie grew up through that era, and he can do that. And it's you might think he's practicing the part forever, which in some circumstances I'm sure he does. But he's that much of a talent, that much of a reader, and that much of a great improviser that he can just on a spot create something that's so perfect that you would never imagine it was improvised.
That's amazing. It's just so inspiring too, and especially in the classical realm, we often forget that area of study even exists sometimes, and that's why I've kind of tried to feature a few guests with it on the podcast here, because it's rather new to me as well. And
it is. Yeah, sure. And just a little tidbit: Eddie is now 75, and he's still practicing every single day as hard as you can imagine. His love for playing and music has not evaporated, and that's also served as a role model for me, because the music industry, no matter which facet you're in, can beat you up pretty good. No one is immune to that. There are gigs you want to have that maybe you don't get, or you don't get called for, or there's auditions that someone else wins. There's always things that can drag you down, or the gig you're on ends up being a drag. The conductor's a drag, or your colleagues are not real colleagues. Someone's trying to undermine you. You just never know. So, as in any business, you can really get hurt. But I've seen a lot of people lose their love for music and for practicing over the years. But Eddie Daniels is still to this day committed and in love with the clarinet and as passionate as ever about music. And that's something, I think that we should all hold on to.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. So many people are interested in music or love music when they're younger, but especially those who take music careers sometimes get a little bit, let down almost, and become very unsatisfied as they get older. But some really hang on, and that's so inspiring to me.
Yeah, that's a polite way of saying it, Sean.
We've got a local guy here. He's 80 years old this year. This is just all over the news. I know him from around town. 80 years old, just got nominated for his first Juno Award because he just recorded his first CD, and it's been a huge success. And that's the kind of passion that many 25-year-old musicians don't have.
Exactly. Tell me his name so I can learn about him.
Oh, it's Muirhead.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I'll send you some information. Just a great player, and we actually recorded our album at the same studio with the same engineer, and we were talking about how just amazing it is for him to go and do that at this age. It's fantastic. So.
It is. And there are so many musicians that I've met throughout the United States, certainly, older musicians who still are playing so great and are so in love with music. On the West Coast, there's a fellow named Gene Cipriano, one of the most beloved woodwind doublers in history, and one of the most recorded doublers. He plays all the woodwinds and oboe, but he's a great jazz tenor player and still plays every week at a club and sounds just great. I'm not talking about good. I'm talking about great. And so, when you hear stories about that, and like you're saying about Al Muirhead, that's what should keep, we should hold on to.
Absolutely.
Because, music is not just for the gigs and for your career. Even if after you retire from a gig or from, let's say, an orchestral job, that doesn't mean you stop playing. Stanley Drucker certainly is one person everybody knows about, and had over 60-year career with the New York Philharmonic. And when Stanley retired, I engaged him at the university that I taught at to play a recital. And now listen to this if you want to hear something. Stanley was, I think, 82 at the time, maybe 83. Mm-hmm. And he picked a recital of Weber Concertino, Rossini Introduction, Theme, and Variations, Boulez Domain, and Brahms, I think it was the F minor sonata.
Wow.
That's now watch this. He did it without intermission, one right after another.
Oh my God. It's like an hour, over an hour of music, I think.
That's a full hour and 15 minutes of music.
Yeah.
And some of the hardest music, technical music, 82, 83 years old, and I'm telling you, he nailed it. I kept thinking, no one's going to believe this if I tell people about it, but I still do. He just ate it up, and he could have gone on for another hour if we had, set the recital to be that length. Wow. He was just, it was not a problem. And by the way, before the recital, he came out, just tested, with the piano, the balance and the pitch. And for about a half hour, 40 minutes before the recital, sat in the audience with his clarinet case closed, just relaxing and talking to people as if there was nothing going to happen that was, of any consequence. And then he went out and played this recital straight through.
Totally relaxed.
Yeah, 82, 83 years old with technical fluency that, I wish I ever had, or anybody at 20 years old would be thrilled to have. I mean,
absolutely amazing.
So, we hear these stories, and man, that's what it is. That's what it's about.
So I want to get right into your CD here, but before we do that, I wanted to quickly ask, because I think this is a really interesting topic. What was it like pursuing the goal of the multiple woodwind degree, and what challenges did you meet along the way?
Okay. So in specific, that was for the doctorate. Well, the truth of the matter is I never wanted to get a doctorate in music. Believe me. After I had graduated from Juilliard, at that point, I had two masters, one in music ed, one in music performance. And I thought when I got out of Juilliard, I said, that's it. You're never going to find me in another school again. I don't want to be around this anymore. I just want to go play. And I like teaching as well. I mean, I love teaching privately, but I just wanted to play. Well, as years went by, maybe another 15 years later, and I'm married, have a family, and I enjoyed teaching privately. I really did. I thought, well, teaching at a college would be fun. I'd already had a little dab of teaching as when I got my music ed degree in elementary school and middle school. And I had taught for a year when I got out of Juilliard just to pay off my student debt at a very wealthy country day school in a high school situation. So I had taught basically from 4th grade through 12th grade. And I realized I don't want to do this, but college teaching intrigued me. A job came up. I won the audition. And the requisite for the job that was advertised was master's required. So I figured, great. Well, I found out when I got to this school that if I wanted to advance, in other words, move on from assistant professor to associate to full professor, you had to have a doctorate. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. And by that time, in almost the mid-90s, every school in the country and outside was requiring our doctorates. And I thought, well, if I wanted to get out of New York City and move away at a certain point in time, I'm going to have to get a doctorate. So I went back to school to get the doctorate begrudgingly. But I made a condition for myself that if I was going to do this, I was going to do it on my terms and do it in multiple woodwinds, because that's what I was. I was a doubler. I was working full-time and had already worked full-time for about 15 years at that time in the industry. And I wanted to, take it on all my instruments and learn something. Because I always felt that when I went to school, I was learning what I had to learn. some of the things I learned I didn't care about, and some of the things that I wanted to learn wasn't available. So I worked it out with the Graduate Center of the City University of New York that I would study with, various people. So I took lessons, studied some Baroque flute, studied some orchestral flute, studied the opera repertoire with the principal clarinet of the Met Opera, Joe Allard at the time. So I was picking and choosing areas that I hadn't studied with in repertoire that I didn't know. And so they let me do that. I had already had a position. I was assistant professor at a university. So here I am going for a doctorate and already have a full-time position at a university, which is a little unusual. And I was working full-time. I think I was doing, I can't remember what Broadway shows I was doing. I know one of them was Fosse. And boy, they all draw a blank here on what other shows.
That's okay.
But anyway, I was working full time on Broadway, doing freelance gigs, orchestral gigs, subbing with all the various freelance orchestras in the New York area, giving recitals, going to school, getting my doctorate, and teaching full time. So I was up to my head in work, but at least I was getting the degree in an area that I cared about, and hopefully helping my playing along at the same time. So that was a little unusual, but the truth of the matter is the real education as a doubler for me always came on the job. Even so much as that very first experience being insulted by the stripper. Learning that, you have to play flute, and then doing club dates where you were forced to, you needed to know a large repertoire of standard tunes. You had to play jazz. You had to be able to play a show on site without a rehearsal. And you had to fake tunes, fake harmonies. This was all part of the learning experience you got by playing in bands and little freelance gigs that were available. You also learned how to juggle and organize your schedule, because if you had to go from a rehearsal band to a gig to a late night Latin gig sometimes, which was very much available in New York in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, into the 90s. You really had to be on top of things. You had to make sure your horns were in good shape. You had the right equipment. You had the proper mouthpiece, to go in and play a gig, with a sax section as opposed to playing in a chamber group. It was a very good experience, and there were so many great players in New York, and so much opportunity to be around them. Even if you didn't play with them, you could go study with them. And, that was worth everything. So as much as the schools at the time gave me some, basic foundations and stuff, the real job learning, and I still think that's the case, happens on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was fortunate to be what I consider the last generation that had a chance to get a sneak peek of what it was like to work as a full-time woodwind doubler in jazz, commercial, classical music, where there was enough work to, get experience in all those areas.
Yeah, I don't know that exists, in Calgary here. I don't think there's a single full-time job where that's like your main role. People are usually self-employed and sort of freelancing, and they can still make themselves a full schedule. But yeah.
There are some radio bands in Europe sponsored by their respective states. Germany has quite a few, but also many of the Scandinavian countries do, where a lot of that is required, where you have to be adept at jazz and commercial music and have also understanding of Western European classical music phrasing. But in the United States, quite frankly, we no longer have steady jobs that require that. The closest thing that one sees is the jobs that are on Broadway, where the musical theater jobs come in and are of all different styles. And so if you're going to survive on Broadway as a multiple woodwind player, you really have to know styles. And look, that's even true of the world of clarinet playing on Broadway, which is had some interesting turns in recent years. It's not enough just to play B-flat and A clarinet and bass clarinet and E-flat clarinet. You also have to know how to swing a little bit, how to play in other styles of music. And look, I've been playing, subbing for a friend recently over at Fiddler on the Roof, which is another revival of this production, and a wonderful revival that's got lauded and probably will run for quite a while. But, you have to know how to play klezmer-style clarinet in that show. And there are some huge clarinet cadenzas. I mean, 3 clarinet cadenzas in the show. There's no one else playing, and it's just you. And you've got to know how to play that style of music. So that's something that's a little bit out of the realm of the usual. But that's what...
It's so versatile.
What you have to do.
Use the word chameleon a lot, and I think that kind of reflects well the versatility that's required for that stuff.
Well, you basically are a chameleon of musical styles. If you're going to survive in the music industry today, most people are going to have to do that if they expect to have a 40-plus year career in music. And that's regardless of what instrument you're playing, by the way. It has come down to that. There are very few orchestral jobs out there, very few orchestral jobs that pay a livable wage, and very few orchestral jobs that have a long-term future, given the declining audiences and the lack of financial help that governments are supplying for our orchestras. So in that end, and as well as the fact that we have fewer commercial jobs that require large bands and large amounts of woodwind sections, whatever you can do to improve your knowledge of all musical styles and your ability to play them on your instruments is a win-win for potential employment.
Absolutely. So speaking of, we talked a second ago about your CD.
Uh-huh.
I really want to get into that a little bit. Would you share sort of your concept of this CD and what you're trying to accomplish with it with the audience?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, I've been in the music industry as a professional now for a little over 40 years. And, I've made a number of recordings over the years, always working for others, whether it be Broadway cast albums or singers, or just jingles or what have you, commercial recordings, but, always doing other people's projects. And because I was also teaching full-time at universities for 24 years, actually with adjunct work, I was 27 years in higher education. It didn't leave me much time to do my own projects, quite frankly. But when I retired from teaching a little over a year ago at the university, I decided, I'm 63 years old now, and I said, I've got to do this. I've always wanted to do my own projects, and I thought, okay, what am I going to do? What should be the focus? And I thought, well, my life has been devoted to playing lots of music, lots of different types of music with different musicians. And living in New York, I had the opportunity to be around so many magnificent instrumentalists and singers. So I decided to try to do something that would capture or be a retrospective of the type of work that I've done over my life and the type of work that I enjoyed the most. So the center part of the album centered around, first of all, doing saxophone section work with 5 saxophone doublers. And so I had a number of pieces commissioned, arrangements done by some of the most wonderful writers in the business, from Marion Evans, John Fetchak, Pete McGuinness, Chris Byers, just fantastic writers. And so that was one aspect. Then classical music, especially chamber music, has been a focus of my life. And clarinet chamber music is the greatest there is for any woodwind player. I mean, I love playing flute, saxophone, and chamber settings, but nothing can compare to the repertoire we have as clarinetists available. And I work in the New York City Ballet Orchestra quite a bit as a saxophonist, and have done so for, I think, it's over 20 years now. And there's a concertmaster there who just knocks me out, named Kurt Nickenen. And I've loved Kurt's playing for years. And there's also a pianist there. The top staff pianist there is a fellow named Cameron Grant, who is friends. And, I was thinking, what could I do with these guys? I wanted to get them involved in the project. And I had played contrasts over the years a number of times. And I thought, let me just see if they'd be interested. And they were thrilled to do it. And that, for me, was, a highlight of the album. And because of the nature of the music on the album, where I'm playing saxophone section or chamber music on clarinet, or some bossa nova with flute, and some orchestrated music for flute and clarinets. I'm really hitting music that is contrasting in itself. So the fact that contrast is on the album fit the album as a title as well. I was able to make use of it in that way. So that's how the title came about, but it's also, how I chose to do Bartók's contrasts. When you have great musicians, you got to find a way to play with them in some way. And, and if you have great music that can encompass that, well, there's nothing better. So that was my rationale, to try to just put down on CD a representation of the music I love the most, the instruments that I love to play the most, and working with so many musicians. I think I had over 30 different musicians on the album, and I think there were about 40 people involved, with 3 different engineers and a couple of different recording studios, and then a separate mastering engineer. And man, it was a full-fledged project, way beyond the scope of what I initially planned, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, these kind of things can blow up in the amount of work that they end up causing, in a way.
Yeah, it mushroomed. But I have to say to the listening audience, here was another thing that stuck with me. President Bill Clinton had written an autobiography years ago when he was 50 years old. And irregardless of what you think about Clinton as a political figure, personal figure, he's quite a brilliant man, intellectually. And one of the things he said, that everybody at 50 years old should sit down and try to write about their lives. And that stuck with me for a long time. And I thought, well, for me, music has been my life. And, a recording really would encompass that. And so finally, when I did get the chance, when I was 61 when I started beginning the process of the album, I was trying to do what Clinton basically had advised people to do when they're 50, was put down in some format what your life has been about. And so for me, that this album represents that.
That's fascinating. So this is almost like your autobiography.
Yeah.
In a musical. What a cool way of looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really why I did it and how I looked upon it. Because if I try to give any other reason at all, it would not be accurate. And certainly with the amount of money that it cost me, I think my wife would probably, if I did it for any other reason, she'd probably hang my head out to dry. and she would be correct in doing so.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it sounds fantastic. I can't wait to study it more in depth and let it spin on my CD player for a few weeks, actually. So one lucky listener is actually going to win a copy of this album. So make sure to follow Clarineat on the email list and on social media, and that'll give you a chance to win this really great CD by Ed. So,
yeah, and by the way, just as a little plug, I'm only selling it through my website. I didn't want any record company, any producer, anyone dictating what I did. That's happened my whole life, and I just decided I'm going to take control of this in every way and be responsible. So if anyone's interested in either the book or the CD, it's only available through my website, which is joffewoodwinds.com.
Are you considering any sort of digital distribution for it, or?
Not at the time, because the truth is, I want the album to be heard as in its entirety. I wasn't making this to make a lot of money or, promote a career at 63 years old. I mean, I've had my career, in a sense. I'm doing this because I'm trying to present a picture of what we as doublers had to do and should do and should want to do. So, rather than just put the track out, let's say Contrasts, and offer that as a digital download, well, yeah, maybe some people would buy that. But, I want them to see what, we as woodwind doublers and doublers throughout the 20th century in the United States, Canada, Europe, what we're about. And we're about playing a lot of music, hopefully well, and making, musical statements in a lot of different areas on a lot of different woodwinds.
I think that's such an admirable thought. One of the things I always recall from when I was younger is listening to albums, and the concept of the album has really been supplanted by the song. And I think a lot of kids nowadays have a lot of songs they like, or a lot of pieces they like, but they don't necessarily have favorite albums. And
That's true, and also, it requires a little bit of time and patience, which the internet does not foster for us.
yeah, when I was in high school, I'd try to sit down once a week with my headphones on and just listen to an album. And it'd take 45 minutes or an hour, or maybe a little longer, a little less, but I always got great sort of enjoyment from listening to the album as an experience, almost like a narrative experience. It's why I really love concept albums. I think they tell a story, and this one, as the story of your life, will be even more interesting for me now. So I can't wait to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's think about it. Some of our greatest works, whether we're talking, let's say, Don Quixote, Reich Strauss's fantastic tone poem. I mean, you're going to need a good 45 minutes to sit down and listen to that. Or if you're going to listen to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's from the late 60s, you're going to have to sit down and take time to listen to that. And no one objected to that, throughout much of the 20th century. That wasn't even a thought. Well, do we have the time? Of course. So, that's the type of society I came up with, and the type that I'm still interested in being a part of. The idea of, well, let me just hear one tune and slam bang, thank you, ma'am, I don't care anymore. No, I don't. That means nothing to me. It would be like going to a museum of art and walking in and seeing one picture and walking out.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is the same deal. So
No,
I'm
I
sorry.
think so. Yeah, and it just reminds me of one more thing. When I graduated from university, I'm only out of school about 6 years now, I guess. But my goal growing up had always been I wanted to have my own CD. But by the time I graduated, and especially now, I sort of felt that medium had dried up, and I almost didn't do a project anymore because I didn't know if it would make sense for from a marketing standpoint. But I kind of decided I didn't care. I wanted to do it because it meant so much, and I think that's kind of what this maybe is sort of for you.
Right, and you should definitely pursue that type of goal. And what little I heard of your CD that's going to be coming out soon, it sounds terrific. And
thank you.
It's important to pursue those individual ideals and goals, and not be worried if it's going to sell or if the public's going to like. I mean, you have to live with yourself first and foremost. And if you really love music and care about music, then at some point, you have to devote yourself to that. Because if you don't do that, then your whole life ends up being what we call a work for hire. Mm-hmm. And I don't think any of us picked up our instrument to play and got the thrill from playing with that in mind. But again, this is what the industry and, of course, the forces in society can do to you. They can lead you astray from that initial love of just playing music and having fun. And I'm determined not to let that ever happen to me. So this is, part of that type of expression in a sense.
So Ed, we're edging on a pretty long discussion here. Let's break this into 2 episodes and continue it next week. But thanks so much for coming on today. This was really fantastic.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I always enjoy talking about music, and especially with musicians. It's what we do.
Before we wrap up, actually, where can we find you online? We mentioned your website regarding listening to the recording and the book.
Right. That's the principle. Everything goes back to my website, joffewoodwinds.com. But I'm also on Facebook as well, also under joffewoodwinds.com. But the Facebook page, it's a professional page. So it's one of those that just deals with music and musical related subjects. It's not dealing with what I eat for lunch or what you ate for lunch. I don't care about that. So those are the 2 principal means. And there's contact information through my email at joffe@icloud.com as well. So I'm happy to talk and commiserate with any other fellow woodwind players about things we've talked about today and what's out there.
Something else we should mention, if you're interested, listeners, is that there's a bunch of interviews that he's done on his website as well through YouTube. So if you're interested in hearing more of what he has to say, kind of on the other side of the microphone, that'd be a great place to check that out.
Yeah, it's a series I started about a year and a half ago called the Woodwind Legacy Series, and I think I've done about 8 or 9 now, and there's a couple of more coming up with various woodwind players, saxophone, clarinet players, flute players, doublers. I'm actually doing one next month with repairmen. And so I've also done one with Broadway conductors, so you can get a perspective of what the Broadway conductors are expecting from their players and from the doublers. So, it's just trying to add to the overall information that we're, all sharing on the internet these days. And hopefully it helps a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, and we'll continue the conversation next week.
You bet. Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.
Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds.